anyone who presumes to speak in favor of the so-called US-led liberal international order. And for that matter, it should also be required reading for critics like me, who will see their criticism no doubt sharpened and deepened. Patrick Porter is professor of international security and strategy at the University of Birmingham. He is also senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and a fellow of this very Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And I am equally pleased to have Emma Ashford and Michael Lind with us to discuss the book and the many issues that it raises. Emma is a research fellow in defense and foreign policy at the Cato Institute. She focuses on the international security and politics of energy, and her writing ranges widely on US foreign policy. She's also the host of the podcast Power Problems, which I highly recommend to you as you power through the pandemic. And we have Michael Lind. He is a professor of practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. You might think that his resume would indicate conventional views. He served in the State Department, edited Harper's and the New Yorker, among other publications, and co-founded New America, but the truth is quite the contrary, as you can tell from the title of his book, which is also out this year, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. So why don't I start out with a few questions for Patrick, and then we'll open up the conversation to Emma and Michael, who should feel free to come in at any point. And we also invite audience questions, which I see are already coming in from Zoom. So that's terrific. Patrick, before you tell us why you think the promise of liberal order is a false one, why don't you tell us what the promise is and why it is alluring to the people who make US foreign policy?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen and Michael and Emma, and to Quincy and to the millions worldwide. Well, the promise of liberal order is simply that a great power, the United States, when it became the world's superpower, became a hegemon. But unlike all the hegemons before it, was not imperial. It reinvented the world around its own liberal image. If liberalism means the liberation from tyranny, and if an order is a hierarchy that you create on your terms, this was the first time in the species history that a country had rebuilt the world and its foundations around these principles. So it's an argument that actually America domesticated the world, or large parts of the world, and the way the world operated to its values. That it then tamed that world into order and rescued it from depression, from autarky, from spheres of influence, from empire. And what's more, it's a promise about the present and the future, that things have gone wrong predominantly because people have forgotten that vision, because they've departed from it, and because its enemies at home and abroad are busy stabbing it and destroying it. That in other words, the American order itself is innocent of its own decline, is innocent of the crisis. Okay, it's not perfect, but the basic principles are sound. And therefore, in the future, if we are to climb out of the rubble of plague and war and debt and Trumpian demagoguery and all of that bitterness on the internet, what we need to do is to go back to the basic orthodoxies of free trade, of renewing vows with allies and expanding alliances, of leading the world's democracies against dictatorships, to order restoring military action, and to a kind of global armed supremacy. And I think this is alluring because it offers both the idea that America transformed the world and made a world historical difference, and at the same time that things are going wrong because people forgot how excellent it was, and it gets a whole way of looking at the world off the hook.
And I was struck, perhaps as an example of what you're saying, by a section of the book that does something very simple. It shows how some influential commentators have taken completely contradictory positions just in the span of the last several years. For example, the commentator Ann Applebaum has recently called US-led security organizations special and inviolable, okay, almost sacred, ends in themselves. This is presumably in response to Trump's rhetorical attacks on NATO and other alliances. And yet, as you show, just 4 years ago, she was urging the Obama administration to threaten to leave NATO in order to gain concessions. So much for an inviolable relationship. Patrick, so it seems like you think there's something at work here that runs deeper than just opportunistic partisanship, and certainly goes beyond Applebaum, who's just one of several examples that you bring to bear. Do these examples show us why the promise of the liberal order is false? How it's possible for one moment to have the same people urging the United States to bully the world, because after all, this is a US-led order, and at the other moment call for a kind of sacred US-led order in which the United States is following rules and serving the common good.
Right. So there's two thoughts that are both important, but which are hard to hold at the same time. And that is that on the one hand, what we've had since World War II is the least bad, in many ways the best that we have had so far, for all of its many problems which I talk about. This is the gentlest hegemon we've had. But on the other hand, even in that world, the act of ordering others, the act of creating hierarchy and leadership is ultimately very rough work. It's coercive. It involves the smack of government, the threat of coercion. It involves rule breaking, etc. What is striking about the Trump era is that in many respects, Trump is not exceptional in what he does if you look at the actual pattern of behavior. But what is unusual about Trump is that more than any other president, he removes the euphemism, he removes the mask from power. This is, if you like, in the Roman terms, moving from the principate to the dominate, right? Where there is this kind of nakedness and brutishness to Trump's exercise of American primacy. For instance, decades ago, American presidents or officials would, behind closed doors, coerce or strong arm allies to do more or to defer or to follow America's direction, whilst in public affirming transatlantic solidarity, whatever. Well, Trump humiliates them in public. There's something quite shocking about that to a lot of minds who actually support American primacy, that he makes it much harder to look away from the nature of power and from the darkness of power. It doesn't mean I'm endorsing the way Trump does that, but I think that's something that brings to the foreground what is quite shocking, which is actually you can't have hegemony without that kind of dark power politics. And the question is not to go away from power politics, but how to exercise it more prudently. So it's that closeness of leadership and domination.
Terrific. So, Patrick, you advance quite a strong claim in the book that liberal order is a contradiction in terms. You write that it cannot possibly exist. Emma and Michael, I'm wondering if you would go that far, or does Patrick not give enough credit to some liberal ends of US global hegemony, even if, let's say during World War II or the Cold War, they were sometimes realized through illiberal means? Emma, do you want to take that up?
Sure, yeah. So thanks to Quincy for having us and for hosting this great event on Patrick's book. So that's not quite how I read the book, and Patrick, please feel free to correct me if I'm saying this wrong. But how I read it is that there are two phenomena, right? There is the American-led order, and then there is the myth that we have constructed about it, and that American-led order, American hegemony, as Patrick notes in the book, had some liberal characteristics. It's just that they were historically and temporally constrained, and as he notes, you can't actually construct a full order without resorting to some illiberal aspects. I particularly love the point that he makes about the sort of the liberal international order at its birth in 1949, at least according to the myth, really isn't the same thing that we actually have today, but it's become this sort of overarching myth. So how I read Patrick is that he's talking about the reality being a fundamentally Gilpinian notion of order, the idea that hegemons construct an order that to some extent reflects themselves. But then there's the second part, right? There's this myth of the liberal international order, which suggests that America is actually advancing liberal aims at all times in this process, that it's not about interests, that it's much more about liberalism. And from my point of view, it's the myth that is the increasingly harmful part. As I quite liked, again, another phrase that Patrick used is the US as a Jacobin state in the system, or, to use the IR terms, that it's becoming a very fundamentally revisionist state. And that as we buy this myth that we are a liberal force on the world stage, we're increasingly trying to reshape the world in that image, even if it's not necessarily true. So I took that there are sort of two liberal orders here. One is somewhat of a reality, and the other one is the sort of the lies we tell to children that somehow we're all actually starting to believe.
Yes, I agree with the broad scope of Patrick's critique. I think, if anything, you can tease apart the different meanings of the word liberal, which I just find, very confusing in this whole discussion. It seems to me there are three definitions of liberal, one of which is, international flows of goods and money and labor across borders, which we think of as globalization. Laissez-faire, that's economic liberalism. The other is civil libertarianism within particular countries. That is, the right of free speech and protest and assembly. And the third is what used to be known as national self-determination, Wilsonian self-determination, which until recently was thought of as a precondition for democracy. Now you have people saying nationalism is a threat to democracy, which I kind of find hard to understand, since the whole premise of self-determination was that cultural linguistic nation states would have their own governments. So how does this fit the discussion of American hegemony? Well, ironically, you could argue, and I'd be interested if Patrick agrees with this or not. I think it broadly is in agreement with his views. The US was a hegemon, but it was an illiberal hegemon because most of its allies were dictatorships. They were autocracies all the way up to the end of the Cold War in 1989. Most of the states that were allies of the United States in Latin America, East Asia, remember, South Korea and Taiwan were dictatorships up till the end of the Cold War. Japan was basically an illiberal one-party state pretending to be a democracy. Our Middle Eastern petro-democracies were tyrannies and are. So American hegemony was real. The American liberal world order, people get that right, but it wasn't liberal either in the democratic sense, since most of our allies were dictatorships, and internally they certainly were not civil libertarian. And when it came even to trade, the two major capitalist countries that were protectorates of the United States, West Germany and Japan, were non-liberal economies. To use the political science term, they were not liberal free trading countries like the UK and the US. So hegemon, yes, liberal, no.
Patrick, do you want to reply to that? I'll have a follow-up, but there's plenty on the table.
Let's keep going. I think come back on those things, yeah.
Good. All right. John Schussler has a question from the audience. What does Porter, that's you, what does Porter make of the argument that the United States, if it has been an empire, has been an empire by invitation, at least at certain times and places? And I would add to that, inspired by Michael's and Emma's comments, your critique is applied in the book to US global hegemony from the beginning, in origins in World War II and then the early Cold War. But the myth that you object to, that Emma has foregrounded, do you see that as something that also informed US conduct during that period, or is it something more recent that you think has made US foreign policy less prudent, less defensible since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
It's great to hear John's in the audience. I'm delighted. So yes, in times and places, there was a degree of invitation, demand, and in fact, one of the problems we have now is that a number of allies are themselves caught in a grip of liberal nostalgia about American power. In Australia, the country of my birth, there are some in the sort of foreign policy establishment who wax lyrical about an American liberal order, which they claim was quote unquote cheap. Well, now, I'm in favour of the American-Australian alliance, but it wasn't cheap all the time. Agricultural subsidies that shut out Australian farmers weren't cheap. Vietnam wasn't cheap. But there are other times when there wasn't an invitation, that this is straightforward coercion in the face of resistance, because resistance has shaped this order as well. Nuclear proliferation against America's wishes. That large belt of territory known as the Bloodlands in the Middle East, all the way through Asia, during the Cold War and afterwards. The long grinding struggles today in the Greater Middle East, where it's the exercise of power in the face of protest, opposition, dissent, and culminating most recently in the formal request by the Iraqi parliament to leave and America refusing. Now, there is a problem here, though, as you say, that the United States, at least the dominant version of American sort of global leadership, sees itself as fundamentally different, as non-imperial, and that in itself can have pernicious consequences, because if you regard yourself as singular, as exceptional, and as unimperial, then you are less conscious of the nature of the choices you're making. You are more likely to be shocked by resistance and less able to withstand the costs of empire, which is why the era of 9/11 spawned a whole literature of American writing and British writing about empire and whether or not America should come clean and admit that it is in fact running an empire. Now, that's not to say that it's the same kind of empire as the Eurasian ones, but there is a certain false consciousness in regarding one's own projection of power as based entirely upon traction and consent.
Yeah, on that note, Gunnar Olson asks from the audience, how do liberals who proclaim their belief in the liberal order reconcile, their belief in said liberal order and US hegemony? Are they deluded? Do they believe that the United States is a unique exception? Or perhaps is it, going back to what Michael was suggesting, that there is an indeterminacy to the notion of liberalism that allows the concept of liberal ordering to be useful, because you can always find some kind of liberal justification for what the United States is doing somewhere, even if you, Patrick, can turn around and say, well, that was illiberal somewhere or by some other definition of liberal. So is its very slipperiness kind of part of the point, or do you think there's a certain degree of self-delusion?
So I'd say two things, and that's another excellent question. First of all, within the American foreign policy establishment, very broadly speaking, the word liberal came to replace the word Christian. For a long time, during the decades of the Cold War, the language of American power abroad was much more explicitly and unembarrassedly spiritual. From George Kennan to Dean Acheson to Jeane Kirkpatrick, this was about a godly struggle against evil. Liberal, in a way, has become the acceptable, polite way to talk about benign, good and bad. So that's an important sociological shift within the corridors of American power. Secondly, I'd say that, as you've indicated, Stephen, there is a slipperiness to liberalism, and it can mean, as Michael has said, as Emma said, it can mean a number of different things, some of which are contradictory: human rights, sovereignty, etc. But those who advocate for liberal order, John Eikenberry, say, they do know what they don't like. They recognize what they don't like when they see it. They didn't like the unilateralism or the swagger or the militarism of the Bush II administration. They don't like the tariffs, the protectionism, the crude racism of Trump. And in a way, as during the Cold War, liberalism itself takes on a kind of coherence in mobilizing against what it knows is the antithesis. Hence the desire to kind of create a prehistory where you can contrast the heresies now from the orthodoxies then, even if that so-called 70 years of peace and prosperity becomes highly mythologized. But again, 70 years suggests a kind of biblical completeness.
If I could just sort of add a little, I think there's also a distinction that it comes up in the book, but perhaps, you could make a little more specific, which is the distinction between liberal means and liberal ends. And often what we see is that American foreign policy has liberal ends in mind, but that the means that are used to get there are fundamentally illiberal. So the imposition of US military force in order to improve human rights in various situations. And that is a tension that you simply can't avoid. If you wish to achieve those liberal ends, you have to accept the exercise of force. And I think you make a case in the book, but also more generally, that Washington has become fairly comfortable with that exercise of illiberal means to achieve liberal ends. One criticism I would actually level at the book is that I think you perhaps a little insufficiently separate the Cold War and post-Cold War periods in this discussion. Because if we're talking about ends in the Cold War, our ends are something very different than they morphed into in the post-Cold War period. And I think you could perhaps make a compelling case for the use of illiberal means to achieve, pushing back on the Soviet Union and keeping the Western world safe for democracy. I think it's much harder to make that case for the use of illiberal military force when what we're talking about is sort of brush wars in various places or human rights violations or things like that.
Patrick, do you want to respond to that?
Oh, yes, just very quick. I mean, that's a really, really excellent point. I mean, I guess it depends which side you fall in the argument about the continuity or discontinuity in American foreign policy since 1945. I'm more on the continuity side in terms of primacy, even beyond containing the Soviet Union. That, for example, that NATO becomes the instrument of American hegemony in the continent, as well as being there to kind of block Soviet expansion. But I take your point, absolutely. But what's also important about the means and ends point is that I argue that in the tragic, bad, anarchic world we live in, what's interesting about American choices is that some of the most cynical choices to bargain with illiberal forces actually had some of the most desirable outcomes, net gain. I mean, the Nixon-Mao bargain, if you look at that, if you look under the bonnet of that, it's pretty brutal stuff about who suffers, but closing down an entire front of the Cold War. The Dayton Accords in Yugoslavia that freeze and lock in ethnic divides. Even rebuilding West Germany and Japan involves collaborating with old fascist elites of the old order, right, for stability. Whereas some of the acts that were the most self-consciously liberal and ambitious and transformative, economic shock therapy in Russia, or the attempt to transform the Middle East in the war on terror in Iraq, actually have some of the worst outcomes. So there is a real tragic divide there about means and ends, which I think you're absolutely right to point to.
And one of the claims you make in the book is that those who give a narrative of the liberal order tend to exclude completely wars like Korea, Vietnam, Iraq in 2003. And if they don't exclude those wars, they treat those as mistakes, errors that can be separated from the essence of the liberal order. Patrick, could you explain why you hold that view? And there are moments in the book where I get the sense that you're not just arguing that liberal ordering is naive, but that it's positively dangerous. And it's more dangerous to promote the liberal order than it would be for both the United States and the world, than it would be to engage in a more hard-headed, naked form of power politics. So could you respond to that? And then I want to go to Michael after that to get his view.
Okay, so 2 points there. In a way, sometimes this argument is a bit like lawyers arguing and haggling in a courtroom about what should be included in the pleadings and what shouldn't, right? Or the indictment. One problem for the liberal order side of the argument is, where does Asia fit? Where does the Middle East fit? Where do these great, terrible wars fit? Because the mythology loves talking about the apparatus and the virtue of military power when it's standing still, alliances, bases, commitments. But when you press play and watch the actual the bloody exercise of that military force, suddenly it gets very demure. One argument is that Vietnam, say, or Iraq, or even the second half of Korea, were bad because they were lapses from the liberal order. That's when we turned imperial. But that's then a problem, because the architects of those wars themselves, if you look at what they thought they were doing, they really sincerely believed that they were waging those wars in order to defend the order of the world, to show America's credibility and its resolve and its strength and its capacity to deter. Henry Kissinger didn't think he was lapsing away from the international order. He thought he was holding it up by showing that America was faithful to its allies while trying to find a way to pull out, etc. So we need a better account of where these wars fit. I think they are part of the hierarchical ordering. They are not departures from some essential goodness. Secondly, so this is where I kind of have to reveal my sort of hand as someone who tries to be a modern day Machiavellian. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's an idea of realism where, in order to protect and build a great republic at home, in fact, you have to practice power politics, sometimes very compromised power politics abroad. That the path to security is not to go into the jungle and try and convert it and tame it and transform it. The path to security rather is to try and preserve institutions at home whilst doing enough abroad to keep an unthreatening balance of power. That if you do go abroad as a vigilante to transform the world in your image, you are likely to fail and at the same time destroy it at home. And we've seen graphic illustration of that this past few weeks in American streets, in American cities, where the war on terror has not been a successful venture, but it has contributed in a non-trivial way to militarizing and coarsening American policing and American public life.
Yeah, I agree with that. The one dimension that I would stress, maybe more than Patrick, is the economic. I think that institutions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP, the Euro-American Free Trade Zone, I think this is really very central to the defense of the liberal world order, which frankly, I think, and this maybe this answers Patrick's question, like where's Asia, where's Latin America? I think a lot of what is called globalism is really just Atlanticism. It's this idea that North America and Europe are this single super civilization, and you have trilateralism, but people in the foreign policy elite in the US and Europe really feel an affinity for their counterparts, which they don't feel, in my view, for Japanese and South Korean and Taiwanese diplomat. Australia, yeah, because of the cultural connection. But so it's just the one wrinkle I would throw in there is I think that the liberal world order is being used as part of a political project by the economic elites in the US and Europe to remove decisions about economics, the location of industry, immigration, things like that, from national democratic legislatures in the US and in the EU to transnational trade tribunals and so on. And I think maybe that partly answers Patrick's question. That is, they're really much more concerned with making sure that their own populations don't become protectionist in economics than they are with, who controls Himalayan passes and things like that.
Yeah, I think, one of the problems with the liberal order concept, which a critique of the liberal order concept could also inadvertently exacerbate or parrot, is that it gives a sense of either there's order or there's not. Either it's liberal or it's something else. And so the question of what kind of, if we want rules, institutions, arrangements to facilitate trade and so forth, the question of what kinds of arrangements and whose interests are expressed in those arrangements can get a little bit buried. I also wanted to come in on the last part of Patrick's comment, which is that, you know, I see a temptation among US foreign policy elites that as politics gets more divided at home, they think that US global leadership is perhaps the one thing left that can bring Americans together on the home front. You know, there was a David Brooks column a little while ago about how opposing China can be the thing that binds Americans together. But this is, I think, a more widespread, not always so nakedly articulated view. Patrick, you've suggested otherwise, though, that militarism abroad has fueled discord, and indeed militarism is home, as the stunning events of the last few weeks have illustrated. Do you think something has changed since World War II and the Cold War, when, you know, it seems to me a reasonable case could be made, maybe not on balance a persuasive one, but a reasonable one with evidence behind it, that war fighting seemed to stabilize American politics at home? Has something changed since then in the way that mobilization for war and indeed endless war fighting abroad has fed polarization and discord on the home front?
Okay, so great question, home and abroad. I think firstly, what is significantly different since 2001, if not before, is there's been permanent war, or at least open-ended deployments under the auspices of the authorization to use military force. So there is a significant difference between actually permanent campaigns, even if they're being waged only by a fraction of the population and professional military forces, even if they're being funded by the credit markets rather than tax. That's significantly different to kind of just a long security competition with an adversary. I mean, I would also want to push back on the idea, I mean, as you've said, there is a kind of certain Cold War nostalgia out there, that can't we find a great unifying enemy, which then projects kind of World War II onto the Cold War. I would also want to say that probably isn't true historically, that at least on the occasions when the Cold War turned most hot in certain theaters, Korea, Vietnam, etc., it actually poisoned and polarized American public life quite badly, quite damagingly. I mean, the partisan rancor, the McCarthyite purges, the open clash of the war party with the president during Korea, the way in which the question of civil rights for a long time was infected by allegations of communist subversion, the way in which racial politics was entangled up with this question about national loyalty and et cetera, and virtue. And the way in which in Vietnam, I mean, when it really got going, I have this memory when I was a kid at school, I did my project on the Chicago Democratic Convention of 1968. Unbelievable what that did to American public life, and the brutal crackdowns and the riots, etc. But I think what's also important sort of now is that in a number of different ways that people didn't anticipate, the continuous fighting abroad has come home in a number of ways. I mean, we've talked a bit about militarized policing, etc., and I think there's also been a broader militarization of the imaginary, of the elite imaginary, the ease with which people can talk about American cities as battle spaces, as protesters, as people who need to be quote unquote quelled with no quarter. The chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff touring in combat fatigues. Okay, they now sort of regret that all a bit, but it came so easily, so reflexively. The way in which the wars have created a very alienated and in many ways a suffering veteran class. The way in which there is a direct link, I think, between the appeal of Trumpian demagoguery or Bernie Sanders' alternative version of populism to poor communities who have taken the brunt of the suffering of these wars. And of course, the fact that these are wars that are funded by borrowing and deficits that then exacerbate inequality, because guess who has to pay the bill for that? And finally, this is a kind of final point, that by seeking to sustain armed supremacy abroad, that has in the end provoked counterbalancing by Russia, by China, which then injects again into the bloodstream of American politics the accusation that your opponents are working for a foreign power. So in many ways, it's pretty bad.
So I want to turn now from the before Trump portion to the after Trump, passing right over Trump what comes next after we get over the delusion of liberal order? Question from John Cookson. If all Americans read your book and were entirely persuaded by its argument, best possible scenario, what actual changes in US foreign policy might you expect to follow? And then I want to get Emma and Michael to give what they think the implications might be, if they're different at all from the ones that Patrick thinks.
Okay, so there'd be a general abandonment of the commitment to regime change as a default go-to setting of problem solving. A recognition that most of the time toppling regimes abroad creates winners and losers, creates a cure that's worse than the disease, exacerbates conflict, and replaces usually authoritarianism with something worse, which is usually more threatening to American security and certainly wasteful of American resources. So a shift back in the emphasis to deterrence, arms control, stability, and more broadly, trying to coexist with things that you don't like in a world of pluralism and difference, right? So that's one sort of practical thing. I would say as well, one of the difficulties with the groupings who advocate a return to the liberal order, there is in general, not always, but in general, a desire for the United States to lead a kind of posse of democracies in the world against the dictatorships or kleptocracy, or the kind of usually a kind of Eurasian demon to mobilize against. Was I would sort of advocate disaggregating enemies, actually not treating them the same just because they have a similar comparable regime type. Actually, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are not of a piece, and in fact, a skillful and deft diplomacy will seek to actually not only distinguish from them, but actually look for opportunities to make sure that there isn't you're not having a self-fulfilling thing of driving them into each other's arms, which I think is a real danger at the moment. To that end, and I'm sure we're going to argue about this at the moment, if America does have an interest in balancing a rising China, then that also, it seems to me, suggests it would be prudent to try and find some kind of informal settlement with Russia, that Russia is a different actor with different capabilities and different ambitions, and to allow for in the natural sort of historical way for China and Russia to actually the frictions to return in that neighborhood, so that you're not actually creating an incentive for a single counter-hegemonic opponent. So in other words, if I was to try and summarize that, a more focused, more restrained form of power politics, but one which would be, rather than looking for a single slogan and logic for everything, to kind of discriminate about where to act, where to pull back. And of course, how could I fail to mention it, distancing and cutting ties from GCC allies, that actually recognizing that the Middle East and the long war in the Middle East is just not worth the candle. But I've probably said too much already. I'll give everyone else a chance to talk.
Emma, do you want to say where you agree and especially disagree, if you do?
Sure. So, on the agreement side, I would pull out two particular points that I think Patrick makes in the book. So two things that the current approach American foreign policy takes to the world. So two problems. One is what he describes as the ominous fatalism of Washington seeking an era of great power competition. And the second, that our current approach over-privileges one path to disaster in the world. And by that, he means underbalancing. So that we vastly overestimate how damaging it is when the US pulls back, and we underestimate how costly it can be when we go in. So those are sort of the two things that I think, if people were to read this book and follow its recommendations, those are the two areas in which I think actual progress in foreign policy would be the most meaningful. So avoiding some kind of large scale competition conflict with China to the extent that that's possible, and moving away from the very damaging assumption that if the US is not present, bad things will occur. So those are the two areas where I definitely agree with Patrick. I will say that I did have a few concerns generally, just about the sort of concrete steps he proposes. effectively, the biggest one is that it may be very politically difficult to make the case, as he does, for containing China, for intelligent containment, without accidentally making the case for rollback. You could call it the Kennan trap, right? What Patrick is proposing in this book is very similar in many ways to sort of an early Kennanite approach to the Soviet Union. But that, as we all know, snowballed pretty quickly into rollback and all these other very damaging sort of forward policies in the Cold War. I worry that what Patrick is suggesting here is that we try to create a multipolar system where China doesn't become sort of any bigger than it is, doesn't become more of a threat, but that we may end up just sliding into some sort of Cold War 2.0 as a result.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at what succeeds Trump, the parties, I think, are fairly now coherent in their foreign policies. The Democrats, they won't tell you this, but they've essentially written off the idea of the United Nations, policing the world and things like that. It's basically the US and NATO. So if you look at Obama's approach to countering China, the idea was to create this giant transatlantic bloc, basically of Europe and America, but you throw in, our East Asian allies and Australia. And then China would have no choice but to join this. So it's kind of globalism on a smaller Atlantic scale model, which you then gradually scale up over time. And I think that will be the Biden administration's approach. You consolidate Atlanticism and trilateralism, and then you have this united bloc that China has to negotiate with. The Trump approach has been more North Americanist. That is, it's equally devoted to primacy, but it's just very transactional, and it does not see the Europeans as a reliable ally on various issues. And so, the liberal world order people are always denouncing Trump for, being anti-diplomatic. He did replace NAFTA with the USMCA, which actually has the tendency of deepening US, Mexican, Canadian integration, however maladroit he's been in his comments about Latin American immigration. So you just looking forward in terms of prediction, I don't think there's much of a market for a more restrained US foreign policy in either party, but I think you'll have a more Atlanticist party with the Democrats and a more North Americanist, if you want to call it that, with the Republicans.
Yeah, and I'd like Patrick to respond to both of those comments. We have a number of questions about China from our audience. Jan Weinberg, for example, suggests that the TPP was indeed a kind of attempt at containment that has gotten us where we are today. And along the lines of Emma's question, I would also ask, given the critique that you've made of quite a fundamental critique of US conduct for 75 years or so, how do you think a bid for intelligent containment, as you call it, with almost self-aware trepidation dripping off the page, could avoid devolving into an ideologized crusade on behalf of US global leadership, its supposed liberal order, and everything else? Is this an actually realistic possibility for the United States as we find it in 2020?
It may not be. It may be a losing struggle. My fear, though, is that you are even more likely to get an over-ideologized, nationalized, disproportionate and dangerous competition erupting were China to gradually become the hegemon in Asia. That it could actually be even worse down the line. There's an is-ought issue here about what is the ideal policy versus what is likely to happen within the default settings in Washington, right? All I could recommend would be trying to avoid some of the measures that did escalate the Cold War, the discrete steps that did escalate, sort of avoiding grand doctrinal statements, avoiding putting it in terms of democracy versus dictatorship in the world, actually for once appealing to the pragmatism of the American people. This is not about policing everything or a crusade to transform the world. It's about making sure that there is enough of a stable balance abroad so there's no one threatening boss. And that's going to include some difficult bargains with an authoritarian Indonesia and increasingly authoritarian India, for that matter. Avoiding a kind of over-intense arms build-up around China's periphery and demanding regime change in Beijing and avoiding overcommitting to Taiwan to make Taiwan, which I think is almost the central flashpoint, enough of a porcupine that's difficult to attack without committing to fighting World War III over it, right? And for America to be in a more kind of step back as a kind of armorer of Asian states, preserving the balance whilst doing other things, because this is not just a military strategic thing, it's also about ownership of critical infrastructure. Why do I think this is a problem? It's not because I think China's about to try and take over the American continent. It's that I fear that on its current trajectory and its increasing capabilities, it has the ability to coerce foreign citizens and foreign countries and corporations to the point where the democratic liberties of our own citizens can be threatened. The NBA affair, the trade affair with Australia, the way universities are being strong-armed, etc. So maybe the containment is even the wrong word, but some kind of counterbalancing. But it's going to involve as well some kind of engagement in American politics. And in a way, one of my real disagreements with the liberal order people is they're often talking about this in terms as an underclass problem. The real problem here is that the American people don't want leadership enough, or in the words of Madeleine Albright, they've become spoilt with all the rewards of globalization. I think there's an overclass problem. I think it's the overclass that has the tendency to ideologize conflicts, to present things in terms of morality play, to reach too quickly for the gun, etc. And very final thing, there's also an important macro question here. What is the point of American foreign policy, right? Now, if the point is to preserve America's institutions, its way of life, its freedom as an example to the world, that's going to involve grappling with some much bigger structural questions that you've talked about, Stephen, in your foreign affairs piece, and you both have as well in your work. Climate change disruption and transformation, but also the problem of oligarchy, the hoarding of wealth, offshoring of jobs. My only contribution to that is that how can America have less conflict and turmoil to deal with in order to have breathing space to deal with those issues, right? So how can it at least make those problems smaller so it can deal with those macro questions of the whole quality of life? So all we can do is to keep making the case and see where the chips fall.
Emma, are you satisfied on the China front with that answer? A suggestion that maybe counterbalancing might be a different formulation than containment, or that's what you meant by intelligent containment.
You know, I think as Patrick points out, it's a really knotty problem, right? The political incentives point in different directions than the strategic answers, and that's something that we all have to contend with. So it's going to be difficult to prevent a form of containment from sliding into something more. That doesn't mean it's not worth trying. On the question of sort of the domestic versus foreign policy, I think this is something that a lot of authors, not just Patrick, are starting to sort of pick up on in their work. And I think it's really important. Patrick included this really great E.H. Carr quote in the book. You know, he described it as foreign policy as a moral device invoked in perfect sincerity by privileged groups in order to justify and maintain their dominant position. And I think even though that was written almost 100 years ago, that really sums up very well, I think, how a lot of Americans view foreign policy today. They tie it together with economic policy, they tie it together with a lot of other things. And the message that comes out is that what is happening overseas, what the US is doing in foreign policy, is not necessarily good for my interests, it's not necessarily good for us here at home anymore. And so, you know, I think for any new strategy, whether it's the primicists, whether it's Patrick's intelligent containment, whether it's some other version of restraint, convincing people that your strategy is in their interests, convincing the American public, that's going to be the biggest challenge going forward.
Michael, I'm wondering what you make of the politics problem. I mean, it seems, to take your last comment, that US foreign policy elites have not really shaken themselves out of their status quo mentality to confront their failures, even after such a figure as Donald Trump has ascended to the presidency. To some extent,
Yeah.
it's caused them to double down on myth making. So what will it take?
Well, I don't see the foreign policy establishment as a weak declining force. I see it as a revolutionary regime. Patrick used the term revisionist. My own interpretation of what's called the Great Awakening is this is largely an overclass consolidation of power against the institutions which it doesn't control, churches, police unions, which for all of their abuses are like the last major institution that is not controlled by this kind of bipartisan, socially liberal, economically libertarian overclass. So I see this as it's a very aggressive regime, and both Sanders and Trump, on behalf of different non-elite constituencies, pressed back against this. Sanders' campaign in 2020 was completely co-opted by the establishment left, and that has pretty much, the left has ceased to exist as anything different from Clintonism on steroids, essentially neoliberal ideology. Trump was neutered in 2017 by the establishment Republicans in Congress. He's managed to do a little bit, pushing back in foreign policy, at least not starting any new wars. But so I think the greatest threat to democracy right now is our own establishment, because what they're doing is, and I agree with Patrick, they're rewriting history so that World War II and the Cold War were not about the self-determination of sovereign states against empires, the Nazi and Japanese empires, decolonization, all of this. They're rewriting it so it was defending individual human rights by military force, by foreigners, okay? So so the French resistance was not about French sovereignty. It was about, individual rights in France, which were vindicated by the D-Day invasion. So I think we're seeing the emergence of this very anti-democratic, it's liberal in the sense that it's economically liberal and civil libertarian. You see this with Supreme Court decisions. So the Supreme Court has come out against unions and in favor of gay and transgender rights, which are a consistent, more or less elite opinion, because the establishment doesn't like unions and it's socially liberal. So I see this as a very aggressive consolidation of power, and the slightest opposition now, which is mostly from the right, at this point, to what is called woke capitalism and this kind of aggressive social liberal establishment regime, it has to be snuffed out. Whether your magazine is eliminated from YouTube, or Google defunds your advertising, or Goldman Sachs won't do an IPO. So I see this as it's a social revolution by the elites in Europe and North America, they're pretending to defend the liberal world order, not only from the Chinese, but from Brits who voted for Brexit, right? And for Americans who voted for Sanders and Trump.
All right, quite a lot to put on the table as we are running out of time. Patrick, I want to give you 30 seconds. Are you any more optimistic about the possibility of reform from within the so-called elite? How do you see, what's your theory of change, let's say? Do you rely on some kind of grassroots mobilization that just doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, or is there another option?
Well, I'm as pessimistic as I was a few years ago when I argued international security for the roots of continuity in American foreign policy. And that is that I think that there is a theory of change, but it's quite a stark one, which is it would take the coming together of two elements: a great seismic strategic shock and a very determined actor in the White House, specifically, given the imperial nature of the imperial presidency, a very determined president. at times it has looked like that might have arrived. We now have the COVID, Great Depression, earthquake, perhaps. But I don't think Trump has turned out to be that determined an overhauler of the whole thing. Of course, he's shocked a lot of convention. Of course, there's a lot of turmoil and disaster. And of course, in many other ways, he's heightened militarism and American deployments, etc. But actually being fundamentally to question, for instance, commitments in the Middle East, really, I don't see that coming any closer. It doesn't mean that my original formula was wrong. It was just going to take a much more determined actor with a better concentration span and willing to undertake the domestic costs. But there's something about being a giant continental-sized, supersized superpower where it seems that the established habitual way of doing things really does die hard.
Terrific. On that cheery note, I want to thank Emma Ashford and Michael Lind for joining us today for an enlightening discussion, which I hope we can reprise. And thank you, Patrick, for writing this book, The False Promise of Liberal Order, available from popular retailers, and they deliver. And thanks to everybody who has joined us this afternoon. I will turn it back over to Trita with some announcements.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And let me add my thanks to Patrick, to Michael, and to Emma for a fantastic conversation. A bit depressing at times, but certainly a tremendously stimulating one. Before I let you all go, I want to make sure that I let you know about next week's webinar that we will be hosting here at Quincy Institute on June 25th, which marks the 70th anniversary of the start of the Korean War. We will have a panel titled The Legacy of the Korean War on US Democracy, Economy, and Society. Speakers include Congressman Ro Khanna and QI fellows Mary Dudziak and Nikhil Paul Singh. So if you haven't already, please sign up for QI's mailing list at quincyinst.org so that you will get all of the notifications, not only for our webinars, but also for our reports and other writings. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today and hope to see you next week. Thank you.